The restaurant was luxurious, the kind of place where the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the clinking of fine china. Richard had been here countless times before, always for business meetings or celebratory dinners. It was the kind of place that made him feel important, powerful even. And tonight, the mood should have been no different. After all, he had managed to escape the confines of his life for one evening, a break from the weight of his responsibilities, his marriage, and the growing pressure of his wife's illness. His mistress, Isabella, sat across from him, her laughter light and carefree, the clinking of her wine glass punctuating every other sentence she spoke. She was beautiful, with dark, cascading curls and an infectious smile. She had been his escape, his distraction, and for a while, that's all he had wanted. But as Richard glanced at her, a sense of unease settled over him, an unfamiliar knot in his stomach that he couldn't quite explain. Everything seemed perfect. The waiter had just placed their meals before them, seared steak for Richard, salmon for Isabella, perfectly cooked, perfectly presented. But for some reason, Richard couldn't bring himself to eat. His fork sat motionless beside his plate as he stared out the window, lost in thought. His mind kept drifting back to the woman who was not sitting across from him, the woman who should have been by his side tonight. His wife, Emily. Emily had been battling cancer for months now. Chemotherapy sessions, late-night hospital visits, endless appointments with doctors. And all the while, Richard had tried to maintain his composure. He had tried to be the supportive husband, but inside, he had been breaking. The weight of the disease on Emily's shoulders, the relentless cycles of treatment, the helplessness he felt as he watched her grow weaker with each passing day, it had taken its toll. It was a silent burden that he could barely carry anymore. And that was when Isabella had come into the picture. He had met Isabella during a business trip to New York. She was charming, vibrant, and full of life in a way that Emily could no longer be. Her presence filled a void in Richard's life, a void that had grown wider as Emily's health deteriorated. At first, it had been a simple flirtation. Then, it turned into something more. Something forbidden. Something dangerous. And now, as they sat in this beautiful restaurant, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. But before he could fully process his thoughts, his phone buzzed. The noise sliced through the tension in the air, snapping him back to reality. He picked up the phone, glancing at the screen. It was a message from the hospital. Richard, Emily has fainted. The doctors are unsure why. She needs you here immediately. Richard's blood ran cold. His eyes flicked to Isabella, who was mid-laugh, oblivious to the storm that had just erupted inside of him. He couldn't breathe. The words on the screen seemed to blur in front of his eyes. His hand began to tremble as he read the message again. Emily had fainted? In the middle of her treatment? He had been so consumed with guilt for the choices he'd made, spending the evening with Isabella while his wife was sick, that he hadn't thought about what could go wrong. His mind raced. What had happened to Emily? Was this another complication from the chemo? Or was it something more? Something worse? The clinking of Isabella's silverware echoed in his ears, but Richard wasn't listening. He felt his throat tighten, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his wine glass in the process. Isabella blinked in confusion, but Richard wasn't in the mood for explanations. "I have to go," he muttered, grabbing his coat off the back of his chair. "Wait, what's going on? Richard?" Isabella's voice was laced with concern, but Richard didn't have time to explain. He was already rushing for the door. His mind was in a haze as he stepped into the cool night air. The city was alive, bustling with energy, but Richard felt completely detached from it all. His car was parked just a few blocks away, and he didn't waste a second before climbing into the driver's seat. He slammed the door shut, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The hospital was only 15 minutes away, but it felt like hours. Every second stretched endlessly before him, filled with dread. As he sped down the dimly lit streets, Richard tried to collect his thoughts. The feeling of guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder that he was doing everything wrong. He had been there for Isabella, but not for Emily. He had been so focused on the escape, on feeling good, that he had completely neglected the woman who had stood by his side for years, who had trusted him with everything. What kind of man was he? The question echoed in his mind, but it wasn't just guilt that fueled his panic now. It was fear. The message had been vague, almost too vague. The doctors didn't know why Emily had fainted? That wasn't normal. What did they mean they didn't know? Was there something they weren't telling him? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud honk from the car in front of him. He swerved to the side, barely avoiding the other vehicle. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He couldn't focus. He needed to get to the hospital. He needed to see her. He needed to make sure that Emily was okay. When he finally pulled into the parking lot of the hospital, he could barely think straight. He slammed the car door and ran toward the entrance, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. His heart was in his throat as he reached the nurse's station. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice strained. The nurse looked up, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hargrave?" she asked, though it wasn't a question. "Your wife is in room 302. She's stable now, but she did experience some complications." Complications? Richard felt his throat close up. "What do you mean? What happened to her?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, her tone calm but serious. "She fainted, and we're still running tests to determine the cause. It's not unusual for patients undergoing chemotherapy to experience fainting spells, but we want to make sure there's nothing else going on." Richard nodded, but he could barely process the words. Tests. There was no way his wife was just fainting for no reason. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones. He needed answers. Now. He rushed down the hallway to room 302, his feet barely touching the floor. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open without a second thought. Inside, Emily lay in the bed, her face pale and drawn, her body small and fragile under the hospital sheets. She looked up at him as he entered, her eyes tired but warm. "Richard," her voice was a whisper, but it was enough to break him. He rushed to her side, taking her hand in his, feeling the coolness of her skin. "I'm here, Emily. I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes filled with confusion. "I didn't want you to see me like this." Richard shook his head, his heart aching. "You don't need to apologize. You're my wife. I'm here for you, no matter what." He kissed her hand gently, but a cold chill ran down his spine as he noticed the worried expression on her face. "Richard," she started again, but before she could continue, there was a knock on the door. A doctor stepped in, his face solemn. "We've run some tests," the doctor said, looking at Richard. "We've found something we didn't expect." Richard's stomach dropped. What was it? What didn't they expect? The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Richard could already feel the earth shifting beneath him. What was going on with Emily? And why did it feel like everything he thought he knew was about to come crashing down? Richard's hand tightened around Emily's, his pulse quickening as he watched the doctor's face carefully. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to close in around him. Emily's frail body was still, the hospital bed's mechanical hum filling the silence. The words the doctor had spoken repeated themselves in his mind, but they didn't make sense. "We found something we didn't expect." The doctor cleared his throat, then continued, his voice heavy with gravity. "Richard, we've been running some scans and tests for the past few hours, and we found an anomaly. It's not related to the chemotherapy, but it's certainly concerning." Richard could feel his chest tighten. The blood seemed to drain from his face, leaving him cold and numb. Emily, for her part, seemed just as lost. She squeezed Richard's hand slightly, her brow furrowed in confusion. She was exhausted, her face pale, her body visibly weakened from the relentless chemotherapy treatments. "I don't understand," Richard said, trying to make sense of it. "What are you talking about? What do you mean, an anomaly?" The doctor's expression didn't change. His eyes, though tired, were focused and intense. "It's difficult to say without more testing, but what we've discovered is a small mass, something that looks like it could be growing in her brain. It's possible it could be affecting her central nervous system and causing her to faint. We need to perform further scans to determine if this is something we need to worry about in the long term." Richard's heart felt like it was going to explode in his chest. The room suddenly felt suffocating, the air too thick to breathe. He looked down at Emily, who seemed lost, as though she didn't quite understand what the doctor was saying either. She was still holding his hand, her grip weak but persistent. "Brain tumor," he managed to whisper, though it felt like the words had to fight their way out of his mouth. The doctor nodded, the lines on his face deepening with concern. "It's a possibility, but we can't jump to conclusions yet. We'll need to run more tests, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Emily's situation is complicated, and we need to make sure we're taking all the right steps." Richard stood there, feeling like the world had just crumbled beneath him. Emily had been battling cancer for months, and now, just when they thought they were making progress, there was another threat, something even more sinister than they had imagined. The thought of losing her to something like a brain tumor was unbearable. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Emily turned to Richard, her eyes clouded with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was so soft, so faint, that it almost broke Richard's heart. "Richard. I'm scared. I don't understand. Why is this happening?" He kissed her forehead, trying to stay strong for her, but inside, he was breaking apart. He wished he could make it go away, wished he could trade places with her, take on all of her suffering so that she wouldn't have to face it alone. He had been a terrible husband, selfish and distant. How could he have let it get this bad? How could he have allowed his affair with Isabella to come between them when Emily needed him the most? "We'll get through this, Emily," he said, forcing the words out, trying to convince both of them. "We'll find a way. We're in this together." The doctor nodded curtly, his expression sympathetic but professional. "I'll leave you two alone for now. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." As the doctor exited the room, Richard's gaze remained fixed on Emily. Her face was pale, the shadows of exhaustion heavy under her eyes. Her frailty was like a weight on his chest, and the sight of her so small, so fragile, made his heart ache with guilt. "I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry," he whispered, though it didn't seem like enough. It could never be enough. She gave him a weak smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Don't apologize, Richard. You're here. That's all I need right now." Her voice trembled, and Richard could see the strain it took for her to speak, but she was trying. She was trying to keep it together, for his sake, even though he could tell that the fear of the unknown was consuming her. She didn't want him to see her like this. She didn't want him to feel sorry for her. But Richard couldn't hide from the truth any longer. He was responsible for her pain in so many ways. He had let his selfish desires take precedence over his marriage, over his commitment to her. How could he ever make that right? As the hours passed, Richard sat by her side, trying to comfort her, trying to ease her mind, but the weight of the doctor's words hung over him like a dark cloud. The thought of what they might discover was unbearable. What if the mass was malignant? What if it was too late to do anything? Would he lose her to something even more devastating than the cancer she was already battling? Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, and Richard could feel the anxiety gnawing at him. He couldn't sit idly by. He needed to take action, but what could he do? He was powerless in this situation. It was the same feeling he had when Emily was first diagnosed with cancer. He could offer all the support and love in the world, but it didn't change the fact that her body was fighting a battle she might not win. As night fell and the hospital grew quieter, Richard stayed by her side, the flickering of the overhead lights the only sound in the room. He had no idea what the future held, but he was certain of one thing: he couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not when there were still so many things left unsaid between them. So many things left unresolved. Just before midnight, a nurse came into the room with more paperwork and asked Richard to step out for a moment while they updated Emily's chart. He stood in the hallway, his mind racing, unable to focus on anything except the fear that had taken root in his chest. He wanted to go back inside, to be there for her, but he knew it wasn't his decision to make. He had to trust the doctors and the nurses to do their jobs. As Richard paced the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, already knowing who it was. Isabella. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He had no energy for the lies, for the guilt that weighed on him every time he thought of her. But then, a strange thought crossed his mind: what if there was something else going on? What if everything was about to come crashing down? He unlocked his phone and saw the message. "I hope you're okay. I've been thinking about you a lot. Please let me know if you need anything. I know things are tough right now, but we'll get through it together." Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could feel the weight of the decision on him. He could feel the guilt tightening its grip around his chest. Should he respond? Should he tell Isabella the truth, tell her that he was losing everything, that he wasn't sure he could go on like this anymore? Before he could make up his mind, a loud, urgent sound came from the room behind him. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he spun around. It was the sound of someone calling for help. He rushed into Emily's room and was met with chaos. The monitors were beeping erratically, and Emily's body was convulsing slightly. Her eyes were wide with panic as nurses and doctors swarmed around her, trying to stabilize her. "Emily!" Richard shouted, his voice desperate. He rushed to her side, but a nurse pushed him back gently. "Sir, please. We need space." "We're doing everything we can," the nurse called out. Richard's world felt like it was shattering. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was drowning in fear. What was happening to his wife? The door slammed shut behind him as the doctors and nurses worked quickly to save Emily. He was left standing in the hallway, helpless, consumed by the dread of what might happen next. Richard's pulse was pounding in his ears as he stood outside Emily's room, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He could hear the muffled voices of the doctors and nurses inside, their movements swift and purposeful. But all he could do was stand there, paralyzed, unable to help. He could barely breathe. Fear had taken over every inch of his body. The nurses had asked him to leave when they first arrived, but his legs refused to obey. He couldn't step away. Not now. Not when everything was falling apart. He paced back and forth, his mind in a constant whirl. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, but he ignored it. It wasn't Isabella's messages he needed to worry about right now. It was Emily. His wife. The woman who had stood by him through everything, who had fought so hard to stay alive, and now, she was fighting for her life in that very room. And he couldn't do a damn thing to save her. Minutes dragged on, though it felt like hours. The light in the hallway flickered occasionally, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Richard rubbed his hands together in an attempt to stop the trembling, but it did little to calm him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to Emily's room opened, and the doctor stepped out, his face serious but not unreadable. The blood drained from Richard's face as he moved toward the doctor. "What happened?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper, the words choking him as they left his throat. "Is she okay? What's going on?" The doctor held up a hand, signaling for calm. "Richard, you need to take a deep breath. Emily is stable now, but she went into something called status epilepticus, a severe seizure that lasted for several minutes. We were able to control it with medication, and she's resting now. But we need to keep monitoring her closely. This could be related to the mass we found earlier. Richard felt the room spin around him. The words seemed distant, muffled, as though he were underwater. The doctor's lips were still moving, but all Richard could hear was the thundering of his own heartbeat. Status epilepticus. A seizure. It was the last thing he had expected to hear. He had known things were bad. He had seen the pain in Emily's eyes. But this was something he wasn't prepared for. Is she going to be all right? Richard asked, his voice cracking. He didn't want to hear the answer, but he needed to know. We're not sure yet. It's possible that the mass on her brain is affecting the neural pathways that control her brain's electrical activity, causing the seizures. But we won't know for sure until we get more imaging done. The doctor sighed and ran a hand through his hair. We'll keep monitoring her. Right now, she's sedated and stable, but it's too early to say anything definitive. Richard nodded numbly, his body feeling heavy, like lead. He wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but the doctor's words hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding his thoughts. He tried to focus on Emily, on the woman he loved, but it felt as though the room had closed in around him, the walls pressing in tighter with every passing second. Can I see her? Richard asked, the words coming out hoarse. The doctor hesitated for a moment, looking back at the door to Emily's room. She's resting, and we don't want to disturb her recovery right now. But you can sit with her for a little while. Just keep the noise level down. Richard didn't need another invitation. He hurried into the room, his eyes immediately finding Emily, who lay motionless on the bed, the gentle rise and fall of her chest the only sign that she was still alive. Her face was pale, her eyelids swollen, but her lips were slightly parted as if she were whispering something to herself in her sleep. The machines around her beeped steadily, the sound almost soothing despite the chaos that had just unfolded. He took a seat beside her, gently grasping her hand. Her fingers were cold against his skin, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. As he sat there, staring at his wife's fragile form, the weight of the situation began to crash down on him in waves. The guilt, the fear, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, it all swirled together in a cocktail of emotions that threatened to drown him. How had it come to this? A faint memory flickered at the edge of his mind, the first time he had met Emily. She had been so full of life, so vibrant and carefree, her laughter contagious. Back then, they had been inseparable, partners in everything. But now? Now she lay here, fighting for her life while he had been out with someone else, shirking his responsibility as her husband. Tears welled up in his eyes as he squeezed her hand tighter. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry. He looked over at the small whiteboard above her bed. It listed her vital signs, her medication schedule, and a few other notes. But there was something else on the board, something that sent a chill down his spine. A note had been added to the list: investigate potential link to tumor growth and seizures. It was a simple statement, but the implication was terrifying. The doctors hadn't been able to explain why Emily had fainted in the first place, and now they were suggesting the mass in her brain might be the cause of these seizures. What else were they hiding? Was there more to her condition than they were telling him? Richard's mind raced. It felt as though there was something important, that he wasn't seeing. Was Emily's illness the result of some cosmic misfortune? Or was it possible that someone or something else was at play here? The thought was absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. The minutes turned into hours, and as dawn's first light began to filter through the blinds, Richard had made up his mind. He couldn't just sit here and wait for answers. He needed to find out the truth about what was happening to Emily. He needed to understand what was behind the strange, sudden changes in her condition. At some point, Richard must have drifted off, as he awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pulled it from his pocket and saw the name on the screen, Isabella. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought about ignoring the call. But something told him he couldn't. Not this time. He answered the phone, his voice quiet but firm. Isabella. Richard, I'm so sorry. I haven't heard from you in a while. I know you're going through a lot right now, but I just wanted to check on you. Are you okay? Isabella's voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable edge of concern in her tone. He squeezed his eyes shut, suddenly overwhelmed. He could hear the words she was saying, but they felt distant, disconnected from the gravity of what was happening. He wasn't sure what to say to her. How could he? The lies he had been living, the affair, everything that had brought him to this point, it all seemed irrelevant in the face of Emily's life hanging in the balance. I'm not okay, Isabella. Emily's in the hospital. They think she might have a brain tumor, and they can't even tell me if she's going to make it. I don't know what to do. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Isabella spoke again, her voice softer, more sympathetic. I'm so sorry, Richard. I didn't know. But I'm here for you, okay? Whatever you need. I want to help. Richard closed his eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. He couldn't think about her right now. He couldn't think about anything except Emily. Thank you, he whispered, barely able to form the words. But I need to focus on her right now. I'll talk to you later. As he hung up the phone, Richard was left with a strange emptiness. The call with Isabella had been a reminder of everything he had done wrong, everything he had neglected. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The most important thing was Emily. And he was determined to find out what was really happening to her, before it was too late. The sterile white walls of the hospital felt like a suffocating prison to Richard. Every corner of the place, every flicker of the overhead lights, reminded him that his world had been turned upside down in the span of a single night. His body was exhausted from sleepless hours by Emily's bedside, his mind constantly racing between hope and despair. He couldn't focus on anything anymore except the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, that there was something deeper lurking in Emily's condition, something no one was telling him. Emily was still unconscious, and though she had stabilized after the seizure, her condition was still precarious. The doctors kept repeating the same thing over and over again: we need more tests. We need to run more imaging. But with each passing hour, Richard felt like the answers he so desperately needed were slipping further and further away. He had stayed with her all night, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, but the silence between them had become deafening. His heart broke every time he looked at her, so frail and vulnerable, yet still clinging to life with a strength he knew he couldn't match. What if it was all slipping away from him? Richard knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. The doctors seemed to be taking the situation seriously, but there was always something in their eyes, a hesitation, a reluctance to commit to a definitive answer. It wasn't the way they usually spoke. Usually, doctors were full of confidence, even when the situation was bad. But not here. Not now. He could feel their unease like a palpable thing in the air, and it terrified him. I need answers, Richard muttered to himself, pacing back and forth in the empty hospital hallway. His nerves were frayed. His mind was spiraling. Every noise, every small distraction felt like it was pulling him away from the one thing that mattered, the truth. Suddenly, a door behind him creaked open. Richard turned to see Dr. Matthews, the lead neurologist who had been overseeing Emily's care, stepping into the hallway. His tired eyes met Richard's with a quiet sympathy, but Richard saw something else there too, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Dr. Matthews, Richard said, his voice shaking. What's going on? I need to know what's really happening with Emily. Why haven't you given us any clear answers yet? Dr. Matthews hesitated before speaking, as though choosing his words carefully. I understand how difficult this is, Richard. Emily's condition is complex, and we're doing everything we can to understand it. But I think it's time we talk about some of the other possibilities we've been considering. Richard's chest tightened, and he felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. What do you mean? You've been saying all along it's related to the tumor. What possibilities? The doctor looked around, his voice dropping to a whisper. I don't want to alarm you, but there's something we've noticed. The tumor, if that's what it is, doesn't fully explain the seizures. It doesn't fully explain her sudden fainting spells either. We've consulted with some colleagues, and there's a theory that maybe this isn't just a medical issue. Richard felt his stomach drop. What are you saying? He demanded, his voice rising in panic. Are you telling me that someone did this to her? Dr. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. It's a possibility, Richard. I'm not saying I believe that just yet, but the situation is unusual. The way her body is reacting to the treatment doesn't match what we'd expect from someone with her diagnosis. We've sent her test results off to a toxicology lab to see if there's any trace of something, anything, that could explain her symptoms. Toxicology. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. You think someone poisoned her? I didn't say that, Dr. Matthews replied quickly, though his tone was cautious. But we can't rule anything out. We need to consider all possibilities. Richard's mind spun. Could this be true? Could someone he knew, have done this to Emily? The thought was impossible, but the longer he thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. After all, what had he learned about the people around him? How many lies had he been living? The nagging feeling in the back of his mind flared again. This wasn't just about Emily's health. This was something bigger, something deeper. His past mistakes, his own infidelities, his secrecy, it was all part of the tangled mess that was his life. But was someone else pulling the strings? Was this some twisted game he was now part of? I need to see the toxicology report as soon as possible, Richard said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. I'll make sure you get it, Dr. Matthews replied. But remember, this is still speculative. We're not jumping to conclusions just yet. Richard nodded, but the words felt hollow. He needed to do more. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the doctors to solve this. He needed to take matters into his own hands. There was a part of him that was beginning to suspect something far darker than a simple medical mystery. There were too many pieces that didn't fit, too many unanswered questions. As he walked back to Emily's room, Richard's mind raced. He had to talk to someone. He had to figure out who might want to hurt Emily. But the first person he thought of, the person who had been so close to him, so familiar in his life, made his stomach churn. Isabella. Was she somehow involved? Could she have known about Emily's condition? Or had she been playing her own dangerous game all along? Richard entered Emily's room quietly, his heart aching at the sight of her. She looked so peaceful now, so calm, as if nothing were wrong. But beneath that peaceful facade, Richard knew something was terribly wrong. And if he didn't uncover the truth soon, he might lose her forever. He sat by her side once again, holding her hand, watching her breathe. But this time, his thoughts weren't consumed by fear alone. A new urgency had crept in. Something was off about the entire situation. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the thought was becoming clearer. He couldn't trust everyone around him. Someone was hiding something. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, dragging him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Isabella. I hope you're hanging in there. I know it's tough, but I'm here for you. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Richard's fingers hovered over the screen as he considered his response. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. He could lie, pretend that he was too busy to talk, but there was a part of him that needed answers. Answers he didn't think he could get from the doctors. He needed to understand if Isabella had known more about Emily's condition than she was letting on. After a long moment of hesitation, Richard tapped out a reply, "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me somewhere?" It wasn't long before Isabella responded. "Of course. Where and when?" He glanced at Emily's peaceful face, then at the clock. He needed to leave for a while, to clear his mind, to figure out what was going on. He typed out the address of a small cafe near the hospital. A place where no one would expect to see him. "I'll meet you there in an hour," Richard typed before sending it off. He didn't know what he was about to uncover, but he was sure of one thing: he was walking into something much darker than he could have ever anticipated. Whatever secrets Isabella was hiding, he was about to find out. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth. The cafe was dimly lit, with a faint smell of coffee and pastries hanging in the air. It was an odd place for a conversation of this magnitude, but Richard needed a place where he could talk to Isabella without the weight of the hospital or the sterile walls of Emily's room suffocating him further. The soft clink of spoons against ceramic cups and the quiet murmur of other customers felt distant as Richard sat at a corner table, waiting for Isabella to arrive. His mind kept racing back to the toxicology report, the one the doctors had promised to send him. That one shred of hope that might reveal the truth behind Emily's mysterious condition. But even that felt too far out of his reach right now. Every hour that passed made the mystery feel more impenetrable, more elusive. The unsettling feeling in his gut had only grown stronger as he considered the possibility that someone might have poisoned his wife, intentionally sabotaging her fight against cancer. It wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage, it was a violation of everything they had worked toward. Everything he had promised to protect. But the more Richard thought about it, the more the pieces of his life seemed to come undone. The affair with Isabella, his constant lies, the cracks in his relationship with Emily, was all of this somehow connected? Could it be that the destruction of his personal life was the key to understanding the mystery? Was someone in his life pushing him to the breaking point, manipulating the situation in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend? Richard's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the cafe door opening. He looked up to see Isabella entering, her long dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress, but there was something about her presence that made the room feel smaller. The fact that she was here, in this moment, made everything feel more real. He had been avoiding her for so long, but now the time had come to confront whatever secrets she might be keeping. Isabella's eyes scanned the room before landing on Richard. She gave him a soft smile as she walked over to the table, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet cafe. She sat down across from him, her expression open, yet somehow guarded. "You wanted to talk?" she asked, her voice as smooth and calm as always. But there was an undertone of something else, something he couldn't quite place. Richard nodded, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He could feel the tension between them, thick and heavy. "I don't know where to start, Isabella," he began, his voice low. "Everything's just falling apart. Emily, she's still in the hospital. And there's something I don't understand." Isabella leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing with concern. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. "The doctors don't know what's causing her condition. They think it's a tumor, but they're not sure. They ran a bunch of tests, CT scans, MRIs, even a biopsy, but it's not making sense. And now, they're testing for something else. They're looking for toxins, for poison." Isabella's face stiffened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. "Poison? That's a serious accusation, Richard. Are you sure that's what they're looking for?" Richard met her gaze, his jaw clenched. "That's what they said. They're not jumping to conclusions, but they said her symptoms don't match what they'd expect from a tumor. And that's not even the worst part." Isabella tilted her head, her expression curious but guarded. "What do you mean?" The worst part, Richard said, his voice shaking with the weight of the realization, is that I think someone in my life might be behind this. Someone who wants to hurt Emily. Someone who wants to destroy everything we've built together. For a moment, there was silence. Isabella's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly recovered, keeping her voice calm. Richard, you're not thinking clearly. I know this has been an emotional time for you, but you can't just jump to conclusions like that. You don't know who would do something like this. Richard's pulse quickened, and his hand gripped the edge of the table. I'm not jumping to conclusions, Isabella. I've been thinking about this for days now. And there's something I need to know. What do you know about Emily's condition? Have you been involved in this somehow? Isabella's eyes widened for the briefest moment, but it was enough to make Richard's stomach churn. She took a deep breath and straightened in her chair, her composure returning with remarkable speed. Richard, she said softly, her voice low and comforting. I'm here for you. I know you're going through a lot right now, but you have to trust me. I would never do anything to hurt you or Emily. The sincerity in her voice seemed genuine, but Richard could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening of her lips. He wasn't sure if he could trust her anymore. Everything felt like a game, and the more he tried to unravel the threads of his life, the more tangled they became. Isabella, I need the truth, Richard said, his voice firm. Tell me everything. I need to know if there's something I've missed. If you've known anything about Emily's condition, anything at all. For a moment, Isabella said nothing. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her eyes distant. Richard watched her closely, trying to decipher the emotions behind her carefully controlled facade. Was she hiding something? Was she guilty? He couldn't be sure, but the unease inside him was growing by the second. Finally, Isabella looked up, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took him by surprise. I don't know what you think I've done, Richard, she said quietly. But I haven't done anything to hurt Emily. You have to believe me. But something in her voice, something in the way she said those words, made Richard pause. It wasn't what she said that unsettled him. It was how she said it. There was a hint of defensiveness, a cold edge that hadn't been there before. I don't know if I can believe you, Richard muttered, his mind racing. There's so much going on, and I feel like I'm being pulled in a million different directions. I need answers, Isabella. You were there with me when everything went wrong, when she was struggling. What did you know? What did you see? Isabella's eyes flickered, her gaze dropping to the table. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and for the first time, Richard saw something resembling doubt in her expression. I don't know what you're asking me, Richard, she said softly. All I know is that Emily is sick, and I'm sorry for what you're going through. But I can't be the one to answer these questions. I didn't cause this. Her words felt like a carefully crafted defense. Richard's mind was on fire with questions, and yet, every answer seemed to lead him down a darker path. He had to know more. He had to keep digging, even if it meant confronting things he wasn't ready to face. Just as he was about to speak again, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, half expecting it to be a call from the hospital. But when he saw the message on the screen, his blood ran cold. It was from Dr. Matthews. Richard, we have the toxicology report. I need you to come to the hospital immediately. There's something you need to see. Richard's heart hammered in his chest. He looked up at Isabella, his hand trembling as he typed a quick reply. I have to go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The answers, they're here. Isabella didn't respond right away, but Richard could see the flicker of something in her eyes, something that looked like fear. Fear of what? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't ignore it. He had to go. Without another word, Richard stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He left the cafe, his mind whirling as he made his way back to the hospital. Whatever was happening, whatever truth lay hidden beneath the surface, it was time to uncover it. And this time, nothing would stop him. The sharp scent of antiseptic in the hospital hallways was nearly overwhelming as Richard strode toward the emergency room. His footsteps echoed against the smooth tiles, each step bringing him closer to the moment he had been dreading. His heart was pounding, his thoughts in a frenzy. The message from Dr. Matthews had come just moments ago, and now, the weight of what was about to unfold was heavy in his chest. "There's something you need to see." The words hung in the air as Richard made his way through the quiet corridors, past rooms filled with the sounds of machines beeping and the soft shuffle of nurses' feet. The closer he got to the hospital's lab, the harder it was to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He could feel it in his gut, the gnawing suspicion that whatever was happening to Emily, it wasn't just bad luck. It was planned. He reached the lab, and the door swung open just as he was about to knock. Dr. Matthews was standing there, his face pale and drawn, looking more exhausted than Richard had ever seen him. His eyes met Richard's, and for the briefest of moments, Richard saw something flicker in them, something he couldn't quite place. "Richard," Dr. Matthews said quietly, stepping aside to allow him to enter. "I'm glad you're here." Richard could barely find his voice as he stepped into the sterile room. "You have the results?" he asked, his throat tight. Dr. Matthews nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over a thick envelope. Richard took it from him, his fingers numb as he tore it open. Inside were several printed pages, each filled with technical jargon and scientific data. But it wasn't the words that caught his attention, it was the final page, the one that had been marked with bold red letters. "Toxicology report, positive for toxins." Richard's blood ran cold. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His eyes scanned the page again, and then it hit him, there it was, in black and white. Emily had been poisoned. But the toxin wasn't one that was common or easily detectable. It was a rare substance, used in small doses, and highly potent. Who could have done this? Richard whispered, the question tumbling from his lips before he could stop himself. Dr. Matthews didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the floor, his expression clouded with discomfort. After a moment, he looked back up at Richard, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've traced the toxin back to a source. Someone had to have administered it directly to her, either through her food or drink. The levels are low, but enough to cause the symptoms she's been experiencing." Richard's mind reeled. This wasn't just a medical issue. This was something much darker. "I need to know who," Richard demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Who did this to her? Who would want to hurt Emily like this?" Dr. Matthews hesitated before answering, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for the right words. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "We've looked into everyone close to Emily, Richard. And we've found something that, well, it's not something I wanted to believe." Richard's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" Dr. Matthews' eyes met Richard's with a grave seriousness. "There's a connection between the toxin and someone in your life, Richard. Someone who's been around Emily recently. Someone who's been in contact with her." Richard's throat tightened. "Who?" His voice was barely audible now, the reality of what Dr. Matthews was implying starting to sink in. For a moment, Dr. Matthews was silent, as if gathering the courage to speak. Then, with a heavy sigh, he finally said the words that Richard never thought he would hear. "Isabella," he whispered. Richard staggered back, as if struck by a blow. Isabella. The woman he had once trusted, the woman he had confided in during the darkest hours of his marriage. How could she? Why would she? "No," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "It can't be her. She's been helping me. She's been there for me. She wouldn't." "I know it's hard to believe," Dr. Matthews interrupted, his voice somber, "but the evidence points to her. We found traces of the toxin on some of the personal items she left behind when she visited Emily. Her fingerprints were on the glass that had the highest concentration of the substance. I'm sorry, Richard, but the evidence doesn't lie. Richard stood there, frozen, the world spinning around him. He could hardly breathe. His thoughts were a blur, crashing against each other. Isabella had been so kind to him. So supportive. How could she have been the one to hurt Emily? How could someone who claimed to care about him be capable of something so monstrous? But why? Richard choked out, his eyes wide with disbelief. Why would she do this? What did Emily ever do to her? Dr. Matthews seemed reluctant to answer, but he did anyway, his voice low and measured. We've been looking into Isabella's background, Richard. There's something you don't know. Something she's kept hidden. Isabella has a history. She's been involved in similar incidents before. She's not who you think she is. Richard's mind was a whirlwind, each new revelation only deepening the confusion. Isabella wasn't just a woman who had helped him through a difficult time, she was a threat. A danger. The woman he had trusted more than anyone had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible. His breath came in shallow gasps as he clutched the toxicology report in his hands, the weight of what he had just learned pressing down on him. He had been blind. He had been living in a world of denial, refusing to see the truth that had been staring him in the face. I need to see her, Richard said, his voice steadying, but his resolve hardening. I need to confront her. I need to know the truth from her. Dr. Matthews nodded solemnly. I'll make sure you can meet with her. But Richard, you need to be careful. Isabella is dangerous. And right now, she's out there, free to do whatever she wants. You need to act quickly. Richard barely heard him. He was already on his way out of the room, his mind set on one thing, finding Isabella and making her face the truth. The hospital's walls seemed to close in on him as he hurried down the hall, his thoughts consumed with the image of her, the woman he had once thought was his ally, now revealed to be his greatest enemy. The moment he reached the parking lot, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, almost afraid to see who it was, but he knew. It was her. It was Isabella. I know you're angry, Richard, the message read, but I promise you, everything I did for us. For you. Come to the place where it all started. I'll be waiting. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. She knew he was on to her. She was taunting him now, daring him to confront her. And he was going to do just that. He hit the gas pedal, the engine roaring as he sped toward the abandoned cabin he and Isabella had visited not long ago. The place where their affair had first taken root. The place where his life had been irrevocably changed. The place where he would finally confront the woman who had brought his world to the brink of destruction.